Happy Mother's Day. Yeah, how about it? It's sun shining outside. I don't know if y'all noticed that. So the weather likes the mamas. Weather was like, Mother's Day, let's give them a little sunshine. Fun fact, Mother's Day every single year, the last 25 years, is the day that the most phone calls in this country are placed. How about that? Single largest day of the year where phone calls are placed, Mother's Day. I don't know if you know the history of Mother's Day. It was actually started by a lady. She's proclaimed or described as a peacemaker. Her name was Ann Jarvis. Ann Jarvis was in and around the tail end of the Civil War, and she had this kind of passion to unite moms on both sides of the war. And so she started putting together these events and putting together these kind of conversations to kind of bring mothers together. In fact, she started a committee in 1868, which established the very first kind of glimpse of what Mother's Day was called Mother's Friendship Day. And so at first, it was just about a bunch of mothers getting together and being nice to one another, right? That was the goal of what Ann Jarvis put together. Anna's daughter, however, Anna, continued that legacy by actually creating the official holiday. And then to kind of follow that up, in her mind, it was an official holiday, but then that was, I guess, 1908. 1908 was the very first original Mother's Day, and then Woodrow Wilson signed it into law like a national holiday in 1914. So we've been on this Mother's Day kick for a while now. You know what I'm saying? I don't know if you've gotten good at it. I don't know. I mean, I've had a mom for 34 years now. I'm not sure that I've gotten any better at it. I don't know. I probably should, but that's just it. So right now, if you were to go buy Mother's Day gifts, 72% of you are going to buy cards. That's what consumers say, right? 72% of you are going to buy cards. About half of you that are left in that what was the math there? 28% left are going to buy chocolate or candies or something like that. And then I don't know what the rest of you get, jewelry. I don't know. I'm not sure what the last little piece of. But cards and flowers and phone calls since 1908. I don't know. Do we have a telephone in 1908? I don't know. Yes, anybody? Sure we did. Mothers. Mamas. Mom. Mommy. Ma. Grandmother. Mimi. Titles. Titles with meaning. Titles with responsibility. What if we took the title away? What if the responsibility was still there, but you did not have the title? What if you had the responsibility that comes with being a mother, and the child did not know that you were their mom? Could you do it? Interact every day, feed, take care of, make sure they survive. No title, no knowledge. There's a place in the book of Exodus. Exodus is the second book in the Bible. When you open it up to the very beginning, you'll see Genesis, and you go one book over and you'll find the book of Exodus. The very beginning of this book is where we're going to kind of camp out for the next few moments. And we're going to take a look at a story where some of those things took place. Let me give you our setting. We are in Egypt. Egypt at this time was a power, a world power, that had one of the strongest, most vast armies in the world. And there was a group of people that was hanging out in Egypt. If you are someone who's grown up in the church, this might be a little refresher for you. If you haven't, and this is your first time here at this church, or first time in church, period, or maybe first time in church in 10, 20 years or what have you, let me give you just a little bit of a refresher what's happening. About 300 years prior to when this story takes place, there's a man named Joseph. And Joseph brings his entire people to Egypt. Joseph was a pretty high official in Egypt. He wasn't from Egypt. He actually got sold into slavery and ended up in Egypt. But long story short, he brings his entire family, which consisted of about 76 people. That's very specific for an about number, but 76 people came to Egypt, and they settled in the northern part of Egypt in a place called Goshen. If you were to picture the country of Egypt, if you can go to the continent of Africa and go to the very top of the continent of Africa and then go a little bit to the right, that's where you will find Egypt. And the very kind of top of that corner of Egypt is going to be the land of Goshen. Goshen was a very fertile place. It's where if you were a farmer, you would want to live. This is not the Sahara Desert happening here. This is around the Nile River, and so there's lots of lush greenery. It's a great place if you're a herdsman to feed and water your cattle. In fact, there's 2.5 million people here from Joseph's family now. They've gone from 600 in about 310, 320 years. They've grown from 76 folks to 2.5 million of them. It's a massive, massive group of people. And so that's where we are in the land of Egypt. And so Joseph's very important. Joseph was important because he was very important to Egypt. He saved them from a famine. He did a lot of favors for the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh exalted him and kind of put him in this high place. And so he had a reputation. And his people then got to kind of ride on the coattails of that reputation. That's how they got the land, after all. Joseph actually went to the Pharaoh and said, hey, can I bring my people here? And the Pharaoh said, absolutely, of course, pick any land. In fact, let's give you the best land. Let's give you land of Goshen. And so Joseph's reputation had gotten a lot done on his people's behalf for quite some time. And as we kind of move through this moment, this story in Joseph's life, or not Joseph's life, but in the people of Israel, we see that there's a place in the book of Exodus, chapter 1, verse 8, that says this: Then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. And so there was a moment in time where the people that were in charge of Egypt, they had forgotten who Joseph was. His reputation was no longer preceding him, right? That just didn't exist. And so Joseph meant nothing to them anymore. And they started looking around and said, why do we have 2.5 million people hanging out in our prime real estate? Here's the other thing about the land of Goshen. If you were to picture again the country of Egypt, to the south and to the west is the Sahara Desert. So no army is marching through that. To the north, there's a big sea. The only place to get into Egypt, if you were an enemy, is going to become through the land of Goshen. That's the passageway out into the Middle East, to the Arabian Peninsula. And so they said, hey, we have a bunch of foreigners in our land. So what should we do when we have a bunch of foreigners in our land that we don't want them to take over and change our way of life? Maybe you've asked that question before. For sure, there's an answer here in this. They said, let's make them slaves. So that's what they did. They enslaved them. They said, we don't want any of their stuff rubbing off on us, and we certainly do not want them taking over, so we will enslave them. They wanted to get something out of them. Specifically in chapter 1, verse 11, it says this, that they were forced to build the cities Pithom and Ramses. Now, those cities weren't called out at the time. We go back through history and we realize that those are the cities that they created. They weren't named from the beginning, Pithom and Ramses. That's what they became known as. But here's the thing, that didn't work. When they said, hey, let's deal shrewdly with them, let's suppress them, let's enslave them, and that will kind of squash their numbers, it didn't work. The more they did it, the more they grew. And so they decided to take another stab at it. And so they called in the midwives that would help give birth to all of the Hebrew women. And they called them in and they said, hey, here's the deal. This is what we want you to do. When these Hebrew women have their babies, if it's a boy, we want you to kill it. That's the rule. Every boy that comes out, the Hebrew mother, kill it. Well, the Hebrew wives agreed and went away and did not follow orders. Eventually, they found out that they didn't follow orders, so they brought them back in, and they said, hey, why haven't you done what you're supposed to be doing? And their excuse was, these Hebrew women are very vigorous. They give birth before we can get there. Like the call comes in, hey, she's going into labor. By the time we get there, the baby's out and gone. It's just disappeared. It's like she never even had a baby. Hashtag motherhood. Well, that doesn't work. And so they go to another measure. They say, if we can't trust midwives, I know for sure I can trust soldiers. And so they said, just kill them all. When you see a Hebrew child, a Hebrew boy, a little Hebrew baby, when you see it, kill it. Throw it into the Nile, specifically, is what they said. Well, in chapter 2, verse 1 and 2, it says this: a man of the house of Levi married a Levite woman and had a son. The house of Levi is one of the 12 tribes of Israel, right? So it's a house, right? The Levites actually become kind of religious leaders of the temple, right? They're kind of leading the religious ceremony. Eventually, that's what ends up happening. And so this Levite marries this other Levite, and they have a baby boy here in this situation where all baby boys are supposed to be killed. Well, immediately, the mom, she has to go into thinking mode. She's like, okay, well, they didn't have like sonograms, or ultrasounds, so they could kind of like see what's happening, right? They didn't know if it was a boy or girl before the boy or girl got there. Here comes out the baby, and they check, and they're like, oh, it's a boy. We need to hide, right? That's what's happening. Immediately, so hey, midwife's on his way, or soldiers are coming. Maybe they heard the screaming. I don't know. But we got to get rid of them. What are we going to do? We don't want anything happening to them. Boys had just been thrown into the Nile day after day after day. You can imagine how many people are giving birth when there's 2.5 million people in one particular city. And so they go into action. His mom goes to hiding him. That lasts for about 3 months. For 3 months, she hides this baby boy. She said, I brought you into this world, but that's not enough. I want to make sure you live. I want to make sure that you survive in it. They hide him, and eventually they could not hide him any longer. He was about 3 months old, and I don't know what happens at 3 months. I don't remember. My kid's 4. I don't remember the 3-month mark. They said, hey, you're unhideable at this moment. But something happened, and they said, we can't hide him anymore. So what will they do? And so she went and she made a basket. She weaved this basket out of reeds, and she covered it with this waterproof tar/pitch substance. And she put her little boy in the basket, and she set it in the Nile. She pushed it away. Talk about every dream you ever had, letting it go. Just praying that God would be faithful, that God would provide. The basket rolls on down the river. His big sister actually is following. Her name's Miriam. Miriam's between the ages of 7 and 10 years old at this point in time. And so she's following along as the basket kind of goes down, and it just so happens that Pharaoh's daughter was in the northern part of the country at that time. There was a pretty special city up that way, so it wasn't abnormal to have royalty up in that way. And she was down bathing in the river, and she heard the little baby crying. And she went over and she opened the basket and saw him, and she pulled him out of the water. And he was given the name Moses, which means to be taken out of the water. Miriam, Moses' big sister, was close by, and so she got a little closer, and she actually had the audacity, the nerve, or maybe the love, to walk up to this princess and say, should I go and find a Hebrew slave to nurse him for you? I mean, after all, she hadn't given birth, and so she wasn't in a biological state to nurse. She said, hey, that's a good idea. And so she runs back, and guess who she asks to come and be the nurse? His mother. It's difficult to say how long this nursing moment went. Most historians think it's in the range of 2.5 to 4 years, where mom would have to act like hired help and nurse a baby who learned to call someone else mama. You know, her name is not even mentioned in the story. We find out later what her name is. It's Jochebed. Maybe that's why they didn't mention her name. I don't know. How do you spell that? I don't want to get it wrong. She's actually mentioned twice, later on in chapter 6 and in Numbers chapter 26, verse 59. I can't imagine what that must have been like to take care of your child and not have the title. For him to grow up, the book of Hebrews in the New Testament tells us that he grew up and was educated in every single way that an Egyptian prince would be. He knew their language, their customs, all of those things. I don't want to spoil the story in case you want to go read it yourself. Moses ends up being a pretty important guy. He returns to his heritage. And about 40 years after this event, he begins a process that eventually leads him to walking up to Pharaoh and demanding that he free all of his people. And then he leads them to freedom. All because a mom was willing to sacrifice without a title. Monument making is often done behind the scenes. We're in this series called Monuments, where we're looking at the moments in our lives, the memories that are created in our lives that become these monuments in our brains that shape the direction and the path of our future. Last week we looked at teachers. I told you a few stories of some of my teachers that made lasting impressions and created memories in me that shaped who I've become. Mothers have that same opportunity, more so, to be monument makers, to create memories and moments in their child's life and their child's friends' lives that shape who they are as people. But often what we realize and what we come to understand is that monument making is done behind the scenes. The person that makes the monument, they don't get to sign it and everybody comes to look at the signature, right? People don't visit monuments. People don't visit these historical moments because of who created the monument, do they? No, the reason people visit monuments is because they want to celebrate the event that happened, not who made it. Monument making is often done behind the scenes. Here's a question: can you be nameless? Can you be nameless? Can we be nameless? Can we take a look at who we have in our lives that's been entrusted to us and become nameless? Just take the responsibility, but become nameless. To be behind the scenes people. You see, here's one thing that monument makers understand. It's this: monument makers understand sacrificing now in exchange for a better tomorrow. That's tough. That's super long-sighted. That's long game. Sacrificing now in exchange for a better tomorrow. Monument makers do not require recognition. Now you'll find a few that really do want the recognition. And they'll say things like, you know what, they just don't appreciate me, right? Or you know what, I should. And you know what, honestly, that's probably a true statement. That's probably a valid statement. There are probably things that you do that you should be appreciated for and thanked for. But the question is that why you did it? And if you don't receive what ought to be given to you, will you stop doing the right thing? Or you say, you know what, I just want to do the right thing where I'm appreciated. And so I'll go search and find another place to do the right thing so that I can feel the right thing. There are many mothers who know exactly what I'm talking about. they have what we call teenagers. And they've probably thought a few times, maybe I could do this mother thing somewhere else. But they know the kids' 30s are coming eventually. They'll say thank you. Being a monument maker is tough. I wonder if you caught something in the story that kind of just slipped by. Most people miss it. And when we talk about the story, tell a story, even when you go and read the story for yourself, it oftentimes is probably the single most missed event. I can't tell you that I've ever actually heard one single professor, undergrad or graduate school, or anybody for that matter, talk extensively about this one particular thing. I didn't get it until I was prepping for this. And it was only because of something else we're going to do at the end of our message that my eyes were drawn to it. Did you see that Moses was adopted? Did you catch that? Did you see that Moses' adoption changed the course of his life? Did you see that the woman that adopted him just knew, didn't calculate a massive risk, didn't put the budget together? I mean, she took a slave girl's advice of, how are you going to nurse this kid? Oh, I hadn't thought about that. I just thought I should love him. Adoption is a monument. I was born a Davidson. When I was 4, I became a Nolder. Adoption is a monument. You know, I don't know if this resonates with you, but there's a passage of scripture that I want to read to you out of the book of Romans that I want you to pay really close attention to. It says this, Romans chapter 8, verses 14 through 16. For those who are led by the Spirit of God are the children of God. The Spirit you received does not make you slaves, so that you live in fear again. Rather, the Spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship. And by him we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. Do you realize that if you're a follower of Jesus, that you've been adopted? That is why we can be called sons and daughters of the Most High God. Because there was an adoption that took place. This theme of adoption actually runs throughout the Bible. It happens often. For every one of you in here that's a believer, it's happened for you. This morning, outside, when you make your way towards the tent, there's a green tent out there. We've got glass bottle Cokes, and the ice cream truck is out there. You'll find a lady by the name of Anna Marie, and she'll be under a white tent. And she is here with Lifeline Children's Services, which is an adoption agency. I think there are probably many of you that have thought about this. I said, I wonder what it would be like. And you just don't know where to start. You just don't have the resources. You don't know someone who specifically has adopted a child. Maybe it's kind of been on your mind. You're just like, but I don't know where to go. I don't know where to begin. We wanted to kind of take that step and squash it for you. There's no commitment, right? It's not like you go to the tent and you leave with a child. but it gives you an opportunity to start a conversation, to ask a few questions that you didn't know who to ask, to get some information and begin to pray and ask God, could he be calling you to something else? And maybe you're in this room and you're thinking, all right, Clint, I just zoomed out. I mean, we are like 1 year away from being empty nesters. We are not starting that over again. I hear you. Maybe you can help pay for one, though, for someone else. Maybe you can write a big check to help bring a child home for a family that's just getting started. Maybe you can jump in that way. After all, monument making is done behind the scenes. Monument makers understand that the idea of sacrificing now in exchange for a better tomorrow. And monument makers do not require recognition.